All right, let's get started. I hope everyone can hear me. So welcome to this DIIS seminar, which will offer a range of perspectives on how small states can play a role in the UN Security Council in the new era of great power rivalry. I'm Andreas Boy-Forsby. I'm a researcher here at DIIS, mainly focusing on Chinese foreign and security policy. So I'm not an expert on the UN Security Council in the sense of having done any research in that area. But fortunately, we have invited two very good scholars within that field, and I look forward to introducing them in a short while. But let me start by saying that this seminar is part of a new seminar series here at DIIS. In the next couple of years, we will organize several events to shed light on the United Nations as an organization, and in particular, the Security Council. And this is ahead of Denmark's prospective membership of the Council in 2025 to 26, if all goes according to plan. And it usually does, I can tell you. So let me also say that this seminar series is supported by the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'm also glad to see some representatives here today from the ministry. I think we'll get back to that because yesterday evening, the ministry actually launched a new white paper, this one, on Denmark's prospective membership of the Council. It's called A Shared Future, a white paper on the UN, Denmark, and world order under pressure. It's in Danish, I should add. In the preface, the white paper states that a rules-based order is of vital interest to Denmark and that the UN Charter provides the foundation of such an order. I haven't had a chance to read through it yet, but it should be available on the ministry's webpage, I assume. Wow. To begin with, let me provide some background context for today's seminar. So according to some observers, the first couple of decades of the post-Cold War era in the 1990s and 2000s could be described as a golden age for multilateralism in general and the United Nations in particular. But the past decade has seen a dramatic reversal of that development trend as geopolitics and great power rivalry have come back to the fore of international relations. As a result, institutionalized international cooperation is becoming more difficult, while key transnational challenges such as the climate change issue, global health issues, and the dissemination of weapons of mass destruction risk being left unaddressed, or at least not handled in a concerted manner. No organization seems more vulnerable to the deepening great power competition than the United Nations Security Council, which is dominated by its 5 permanent members: China, Russia, France, UK, and the United States, also known as the P5, the permanent 5 members. Of course, finding common ground among the P5 in the UN Security Council has never been easy. But the past decade has seen a number of clashes and crises that have seriously deepened the divide between China and Russia on the one hand, and the 3 Western great powers on the other. We can always argue about which of these junctures were more important in shaping relations among the P5 today. Did we witness such a path-defining juncture back in 2011, when the Western great powers decided to pursue a UN Security Resolution mandate to impose a no-fly zone over Libya in a more assertive way than at least Russia and China had anticipated or agreed to? The intervention in Libya, for instance, made it impossible to find any common ground among the P5 during the subsequent civil war in Syria, while Russia and China cast several double vetoes in the Council to prevent the Western great powers from intervening in the conflict once again. Or did the defining moment arrive in 2014, when Russia violated well-established international norms and sovereignty by launching a stealthy hybrid invasion of Crimea and parts of the Donbass, outright annexing Crimea in the process? As a result, the Western countries imposed sanctions on Russia to punish it and abandoned various forms of cooperation with the Russian government, including in the G8 format. Or should we fast forward to 2017 in our search for the key moment, pointing our fingers at the Trump administration and its comprehensive campaign to undermine international multilateral cooperation under the banner of Make America Great Again. It was during the Trump administration that US-China relations were sent into a free fall from which it has not recovered since, I can tell you. Indeed, in response to Nancy Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan, Beijing announced that it will suspend dialogue with Washington in some of the few remaining areas that were still characterized by some sort of cooperation between the two great powers. Or is Russia's current full-scale war in Ukraine the key juncture that has finally dispelled any illusions that the P5 will be able to cooperate on matters of international peace and security, as the Western powers are pursuing a comprehensive strategy of isolating Moscow in international society? Today, relations between the great powers have reached such a low point that it is fair to ask if the UN Security Council is at risk of becoming paralyzed, just like it was during much of the Cold War era. Indeed, given the veto power prerogatives held by the P5, a conflict-prone UN Security Council will find it increasingly hard to pursue its authorized mandate of safeguarding international peace and security. As one of my former colleagues has aptly described the problem facing the UN system today, the liberal challenge of our time is not to reinvent that particular institutional wheel, but rather to find ways of making the wheel turn smoothly in an illiberal era. Where does it leave small states such as Denmark and Norway, who once in a while get the opportunity to serve as one of the 10 elected members of the UN Security Council for a 2-year period? These 10 elected members are also referred to collectively as the E10, and they are having their own internal meetings on a regular basis. The E10, for instance, held such a meeting in June to discuss the working methods of the Council. Subsequently, Ireland, another Western small state, released a statement on behalf of the group calling for the Council to operate in a way that maximizes its legitimacy. It was phrased. And it also added that by making the Council as representative, inclusive, transparent, effective, and accountable as possible. Today's seminar will help us understand the role that small states can play in the UN Security Council. What kind of agendas or interests can small states realistically hope to pursue during such a relatively brief period in the Council? What kind of institutional tools in the UN Security Council can small states successfully wield to punch above their weight, as the saying goes? Do instruments such as the penholder role, the presidency function, the area or E10 formula offer new avenues for small states to influence the agenda of the Security Council? Furthermore, could one even make the argument that a conflict-prone UN Security Council opens up new opportunities for small states if they understand how to navigate, mediate, or even bypass the great power rivalry? To answer these questions and others, we have invited 2 experts who combine extensive knowledge of the UN Security Council with detailed insights into the Norwegian membership of the UN Security Council. Norway became a council member last year and will remain so until the end of 2022. So let me introduce our first speaker today. Niels Narlhus-Schea is a senior research fellow at NUPI, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and holds a PhD degree in social anthropology from University of Oslo. Niels has worked on and published on numerous topics related to international organizations, global governance, peace building, and more specifically the UN Security Council, including in his book from 2018, Franchise States and the Bureaucracy of Peace, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan. I should also mention that his current research focuses primarily on issues of internet governance, cybersecurity, and cyber capacity building in emerging economies. But today he will talk about the UN Security Council as an arena for international diplomacy and the role elected states can play. Niels, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak about a topic that I'm very interested in. I actually did my first anthropological fieldwork on the Security Council when Norway was part of the Security Council last time, 20 years ago. So I've been following the Security Council more or less back and forth since then, and even more so the last few years now, because Norway is part of the Security Council. So what I wanted to talk about today is actually two things. I very much agree with you about multilateralism being under pressure, and everyone, there's a lot of headlines saying that the Security Council is being paralyzed by big power politics. But nevertheless, I've chosen to give my talk today the title "The Security Council Not So Paralyzed," and I will come back to that. But first, I will talk about two things today. The first one is the first part will focus a bit on the Norwegian membership, and the second part will focus more specifically on why I think that the Security Council is not so paralyzed as many people like to think. There's many things to highlight about the Norwegian membership, but I don't have that much time, so I will focus on just a couple of things. The first one is a Norwegian, more or less a Norwegian invention, I think, because it's something that the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs took initiative to establish just before we entered the Security Council 1st of January 2021. And that is what is called the Dialogue Forum. And I'm co-coordinating the Dialogue Forum together with Louise Andersson at PRIO, and Henrik Urdal at PRIO, and Ulf Sverdrup, our director at NUPI, and the Norwegian MFA. And the purpose of the Dialogue Forum is to help the Norwegian MFA to have a knowledge-based politics in the Security Council while they're there. So what we do is that we organize roundtable meetings, 4 roundtable meetings each year, so 8 in total, on a topic that is very relevant for Norway and the Security Council agenda. So for these roundtables, we invite scholars, only researchers that has so the best researchers that we can find on a topic are invited to this dialogue forum, and we will discuss this topic, and the researchers, they can throw up all their knowledge on the table, and around the table is also MFA diplomats working on the Norwegian role in the Security Council, as well as the Norwegian delegation in New York. And they have the finger on the pulse on the table, on the horseshoe table in the Security Council. So this means that researchers directly from the field in Yemen or Afghanistan or wherever, they can throw up all their fresh new knowledge. The MFA can use this in the way they want to, and they can try to bring it to the Security Council. And I think this is very important because the last 10 years, multilateralism is under pressure, but also knowledge. So there's a lot of fake news and influence campaigns and these kind of things. But when Norway is sitting around the horseshoe table talking about Afghanistan, the diplomats that are sitting there, they know that they build on their foreign service, but also on the research that they have brought to this table. So I think this is very important, I think, and I think it makes the Norwegian membership, it's something that makes it stronger than it would have been if it hadn't had that. So this is something that we have had very good experience with. I would also like to say that I could say that I can come back to the dialogue forum. I don't want to spend the whole time on talking about that. But Another thing that has been, I think, is okay to highlight about the Norwegian presidency, Norwegian membership, is the presidency. So each country has the presidency for a month. Most of the countries in the Security Council has the presidency for 2 months, but Norway was unlucky with the alphabetic order, so they would get it only once. And that was in January. It was a little bit unfortunate because in January there's also 5 new countries coming in and 5 old countries going out. So there's a little bit commotion. And there was Omicron coming back full power in January, so they weren't able to have that good meetings. But I don't think that it affected the presidency very much, because they managed to really highlight their priorities. They had 4 priorities: women, peace and security, peace diplomacy, protection of civilians, and climate security. And they used this presidency to have a couple of signature meetings, which is not a meeting where you sign anything, but it's a meeting that is specific for your interests and where you can really highlight your interest in the Security Council. And one of the most important things that they did here is also a Norwegian invention, more or less, that they invited the Security Council members for a retreat focusing on peace diplomacy, which is one of the priorities for Norway in the Security Council. So they took the Security Council members out of the UN building and to a place where they were supposed to stay for at least 1 night, perhaps 2, I don't know. But because of Omicron coming to New York, they were only capable of having this for a full day, where they could talk about peace diplomacy and getting experts from that could share best practices and things like that. So this is also a good thing for Norway to get the council to talk about and think about Norwegian priorities. In addition, it has also been very important, the pen holding and their different responsibilities that Norway has been given or has taken. And Norway got really heavy responsibilities during these 2 years, I think, because they were pen holders for the file on Afghanistan, on humanitarian access in Syria, and children in armed conflict, and the sanctions committee for North Korea, as well as the sanctions committee for ISIL and Al-Qaeda. And in addition, they were co-sharing the expert group on climate security. So these are really heavy files with a lot of big power politics going into it, especially the Syria file that was renewed. The mandate was renewed in July, but it was really very difficult negotiations. Okay, that was Norway. So I'm going over to the second part, talking about why I think that the Security Council is not so paralyzed. Not so paralyzed by big power politics and the war in Ukraine. So there's a lot of media headlines saying this now. I could mention just a few. So Richard Gowan wrote an article in April or something in Foreign Affairs, and he has been nuancing this ever since. But it had a title, and I don't think he agreed with that title. But nevertheless, the title was there, and it is "The UN is another casualty of Russia's war. Why the organization might never bounce back." That was one title. And then there's another one in a UN media outlet with saying that the UN in crisis, big powers and bad influence. And then you had the Kenyan UN ambassador on the just after the 24th of February, after the invasion, is saying that in the UN Security Council that multilateralism lies on its deathbed tonight. Really, really strong titles and strong things to say. It makes an impression and makes you wonder, is this really accurate? And I really I acknowledge all the things that the moderator said in his introduction, that there's been difficult times, at least ever since 2014, and it began a couple of years before that as well. And the last few years, this 2022 and 2021, we have the Security Council has had a lot of troubles coming together on topics such as Myanmar, Ethiopia. I mentioned Syria. There's also other cases that has been difficult. So there are many crises, and these crises are of course caused by the structure of the Security Council and the veto powers and the P5. And it could be very easy to say that we should get rid of the veto power. But then you have to look at the history and the lessons from the Security Council's predecessor, the League of Nations, where no one had the veto powers. Everyone was equal, and the big powers, they just didn't see the interest of joining the League of Nations, so they dropped out. US dropped out almost at the start. So I think that this is important to keep in mind, because the League of Nations was shut down after 25 years or something like that, and now we're approaching 80 years with the UN Security Council, and it has gone through changing international climate or international situations, like the Cold War, the 90s, where optimism and more ambitions, and the beginning of the 2000s, and then we have now the last decade, and now in 2022 something completely, or not completely new, but international crisis of historical dimensions. But the Security Council wasn't able to condemn Russia's invasion in Ukraine. So you can think that it's easy to say that the Security Council is paralyzed. But what it did actually was that some of the member states, they said that, okay, Russia is a part of the Security Council. They are the aggressor. We can't deal with this topic here. We have to send it to the General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace rule, which hasn't been used just once or twice or something in the history of the Security Council before. Last time was many years ago. And then, so they did that, and they pushed it to the General Assembly. That was the Security Council that did that, pushed it to the General Assembly, which means that the Council is not paralyzed, not so paralyzed. And I think that even giving that vote into the General Assembly instead of the Security Council made it also politically very much stronger. And it also made it more transparent and more democratic in a way, because all the countries were able to vote on that question. And in addition, it pushed every country in the world to have a public opinion on the war in Ukraine. You had three possible opinions, yes, or to support it, or not support it, or abstain from voting. And there was very strong vote. There was only 4 countries in the world. So you supporting Russia. So you can't come back. You can't go. You can't really deny that. That's it sticks. It stays, and it stays there for history. And it says a lot about how isolated Russia was in this war. So it was. I think it's very important, even though there's a lot of countries that abstained. So, how am I doing on time? Right. Okay. And then, so I will be very brief. So, Uniting for Peace. That's one thing that shows that the Security Council is not so paralyzed. It's able to move, has some leeway, move around the structures and things. Another one, quite similar thing, is something that has been called the Liechtenstein Proposal, or the veto proposal, which is a proposal that Liechtenstein, a small state, had worked with for many years, almost 15 years, I think, trying to get this adopted by the Security Council. And last time they tried to get it adopted, that's 2 years ago, it was turned down. But this spring, in April, it was adopted by the Security Council during an international crisis of historical dimensions. And the purpose of the Liechtenstein proposal is that it want to make the bar for the veto powers to use their veto a little bit higher, raise it. Because if you use the veto, you have to go to the General Assembly at least 10 days after you used it to explain why. It's not only that, you have to go there and explain why, but all the other member states in the UN, they can also come and say what they think about the veto power having used the veto. So it makes it more transparent what other countries thinks about the decisions and the vetoes and everything. So the relation between the General Assembly and the Security Council, there has happened things there, right, in 2022, which is very interesting. Some people, some countries would, of course, say that this is not good for the Security Council, but because it's making it weaker vis-a-vis the General Assembly. Of course, the P5 would say that, but I think it makes the Security Council stronger also in the way I have just explained. So, yeah, and then just one final thing, because I read all these headlines, I thought that is this really the case? So I had to go to New York and talk with people to see what if it really was like that. And one of the people I met with a lot of people, but one of them was the Ukrainian UN ambassador. And actually asked him, we had a long talk, and I started with asking him, do you think the Security Council is useful or useless? And throughout his talk, he kept talking about the importance of the Security Council for Ukraine. So it's very, very strong meeting, I think. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Yes, good. Thank you, Niels, for giving us an introduction to the Norwegian membership of the Council, and also for taking time to refute my initial claim that the Council is becoming increasingly paralyzed. So with that, it brings us to our second speaker today. Kristin Haugevik is also a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and holds a PhD degree in political science from University of Oslo. Her research at NUPI revolves around interstate cooperation, friendship and diplomacy, with a geographical focus on the European and transatlantic region and the foreign policies of Britain and the Nordic states, primarily. She has published widely, including a monograph in 2018 on special relationships in world politics, interstate friendship and diplomacy after the Second World War, published by Routledge. And less than a year ago, she, together with Niels and some other colleagues, published a report entitled Small States, Different Approaches, Estonia and Norway in the UN Security Council, which is the reason I reached out to ask them to come here today in the first place. So, Kristin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas. Can you all hear me? Is the microphone on? Yes? Okay. And thank you for the kind invitation to come here to Copenhagen today. It's a great pleasure to be at DIIS for the first time. I've worked with these researchers on many projects over the past few years, and it's always been a pleasure, so it's good to finally be here. Now, I come to the study of the UN Security Council from a somewhat different starting position than Niels and Andreas alluded to, kind of where my background is. But as Andreas said, the two of us worked together on a project last year with Estonian colleagues on the role of small states on the Security Council, looking at how Estonia and Norway worked alongside one another the year that they were both on the Security Council as respectively a Baltic and a Nordic member state. So more generally, my research areas has been rather in the areas of diplomatic practices of small states, and then especially the Nordic ones. And here, of course, the UN Security Council is one important arena where such diplomatic practices come into play and can be observed. So I have structured my talk into 3 sections today. First, I'm going to say a few words about what it means to be a small state. What does that really mean in this context? And second, how can and do such small states play to their strengths in multilateral diplomacy? States like Denmark, states like Norway, states like Estonia, as we studied in our project. What are their options? What tools do they have in their diplomatic toolbox when they come to this UN Security Council, where you, after all, do have the P5 and then also elected members? And finally, what can and do Nordic states do as elected members of the UN Security Council? But let me begin by saying a few words about small states. And I think we often use that word quite commonsensically. So most of the time you will know a small state when you see one, right? So I say small state, and you can sort of come up with examples of what these small states are. So as a practical term, I think it tends to make sense to those using it and in the context that it's being used. Now, as an analytical concept in the scholarly literature, it has often referred to quantitative and material factors like territorial size, like population size, like GDP, or like military strength, and often a combination of all of these. And some would say too that small states are simply all the states which are neither large nor micro. So it's everyone sort of in the middle, right? So, Liechtenstein is perhaps a micro state. The United States is certainly a large power or a large state. And then you have quite a few others which fall into the small state sort of residual category. But in any case, I would agree with the scholars who hold that smallness is both relative and relational. So it depends on the context, really. In the context of the Nordic states, Sweden is quite big. In a context where you're on the Security Council with larger powers, then Sweden might not be so big comparatively. So indicators like GDP or military strength or population size, they only make sense if you measure them relatively and in relation to the context and the other actors involved. So Denmark's population is small compared to that of the United States, but much larger than Iceland and Estonia, for example. And Norway is not really a small state if we look at energy production and development aid, for example, where Norway is, I would say, punching above its weight in terms of its population size and so on. So why does this matter? Well, sometimes size is directly translated into influence and power. In the EU Council of Ministers, for example, votes are distributed according to relative size. In the UN Security Council, the P5 do weigh more, but everyone in E10 weighs the same. And of course, it's not the case that smallness means a small state means small power necessarily. Andreas mentioned that you could punch above your weight, which is actually that you get to box in another category than what your actual body weight is, right? So that's when you punch above your weight. And superpowers can be impotent, and small powers can be potent, as former UN top bureaucrat Jan Egeland once put it. And perceptions also matter. So how states like to portray themselves, and also how others see them. So some states are talked about as states that actually do contribute more than perhaps one would think they could, given their size. And this brings me to the next point. So what can small states do in international diplomacy? How can they exercise power? How can they influence outcomes? And this takes us a bit beyond the understanding of power as something that you have. That's something you sort of come with to the table. And leads us instead to see power as something that's performative. It's something you do, something that's exercised, something that is practiced, also in relation to others. In Stephen Luke's definition of power, A has power over B if he can make B do something that B otherwise wouldn't do. Okay? But A can also have power if he can influence the agenda. So if he can influence the things that he's going to talk to B about, then that's also power. It's just power in a different way. And A can also have ideological power because he can try to influence what B is thinking about in the first place and how B is thinking about those things. So for example, when you put an issue like women, peace and security on the agenda, maybe you're actually also influencing how other people think about that issue. And this is akin to what Joseph Nye has called soft power. Now, I like the idea of thinking that states have foreign policy repertoires. So following Charles Tilly, a foreign policy repertoire is what states know how to do, what they are accustomed to doing, and what it is possible for them to do in a given context. So how they can play to their strengths and find out how they are where they are uniquely positioned to play a role to make a difference. So large states, as I said, they have large populations, they have big territories, they have big GDPs, they have strong military capabilities, they can speak and everyone listens. Small states will in most instances, small states like Denmark and Norway, they will in most instances not be able to match that. It's not like all the media will write about what is said in Copenhagen or what is said in Oslo. You need to find other ways to get heard, to influence. So what can that repertoire be for a small state like Denmark, like Norway? Well, Baldur Thoraldsson, who is himself from Iceland, he's an Icelandic researcher, who has written extensively on small states in general and specifically in relation to the UN Security Council. He suggests that there are 3 skill sets that small states can use to kind of punch above their weight. And the first is that they can make sure to have administrative competence. So they can emphasize, they won't match the bigger states on quantity. Their foreign services won't be as big, but they can make sure that they are good on quality. They can have diplomatic competence. They can make sure that they have knowledge, and Nils talked about this with the dialogue forum that the Norwegian MFA initiated. And they can take initiatives in new areas because they sometimes have that opportunity, whereas large states need to have their attention all places, and small states can actually go in and take a different route. And I'd say too, in the context of the UN Security Council, I think it's tradition for most states, but at least for the Nordics, that they will often send their very best diplomats to places like the UN. So the delegations and the ambassadors will sometimes or nearly always be people of a relatively high rank. And the ambassadors, that's considered a plum posting, at least in the Norwegian system. It's something where you go where you have sort of earned your way to go there. It's akin to the ambassadorship in Washington and in London and in Brussels and these places. So you will have very high quality diplomats, and that's a way to sort of punch above your weight. The second is that small states can cultivate an image and a reputation as norm entrepreneurs. And what do I mean by that? Well, they can be states that sort of, instead of pursuing their interests, they can talk about the shared norms and the shared values. And I think the Nordic states have developed a reputation for doing precisely this. They often come and they talk about what's morally right. Of course, when Sweden was in the UN Security Council and had the feminist foreign policy, it was also criticized for sort of holding the moral high ground. But I think it's something that is quite shared by the Nordics, that they do like to talk about values and they do like to introduce norms to these settings. And the third factor that can give small states more influence is institutional structures. So the fact that you have what we may call favorable diplomatic multilateral arrangements. And this is, of course, very important in a place like the UN. And as I think everyone has said already, the Nordic states are very keen defenders of the rules-based international order. And that's, of course, also because it's an order that has served small states well. It's something that protects small states from being sort of bullied by other powers. So it gives a certain security also for them. So these structures themselves, they can offer some opportunities for smaller states that wouldn't have been there if they had operated in an anarchic system without any rules-based international order. So the fact that the E10, all the members of the E10 weigh the same, kind of gives some small states the opportunity to punch above their weight. So small states, they often have a special interest in upholding multilateral institutions. And so multilateralism is in this sense not only a means to achieve one's own foreign and security policy goals, but it's also, as Vincent Pouliot has pointed out, it's also an end in itself. So multilateralism is important not just as a tool to obtain other goals, but it's important to preserve in and by itself for these states. So the fact that all the Nordic states are keen to take up a seat on the UN Security Council to get an elected seat would also be because they think it's important, and I think the Norwegian government said this very explicitly, that sort of it's something we have to do. It's part of our commitment, it's part of our duty as a member of the international community. So, and I'll start to conclude now, because I see that Andreas got up. So, what is the Nordic model on the UN Security Council, or is there a Nordic model on the UN Security Council? Well, the Nordic countries are traditionally, I would say, firm supporters of the UN. So Denmark and Norway were both founding members. Iceland and Sweden joined a year later, and then Finland joined in 1955. And Nordic governments cooperated at the UN from the very beginning, and they gradually also became a quite explicitly stated group. So they have a tradition for working together on these matters. And of course, they were small, but they considered themselves to be like-minded. I like that sort of expression, to be like-minded. So the Nordics see themselves as like-minded. They think about things in the same way. And in 1955, a researcher called Tormod Petter Svennevig wrote about the Scandinavian bloc at the United Nations, by which he at that point meant Denmark, Sweden, Norway and Iceland. And these countries, he wrote, quote, were taught to have a similarity of outlook, which arose mainly from their geographic proximity and their similar conditions, but it was not purely a result of these circumstances. Unity was cultivated by frequent and regular discussions on League of Nations affairs by the foreign ministers before the sessions of the Assembly at Geneva, and also by the delegations when they were there, unquote. And Svennevig also notes how this extended to the UN later on. He said, from the very beginning of the regular work of the UN, the Scandinavian delegations have been in intimate contact during each session of the General Assembly. So I think, and Katie Latikainen, a scholar who has researched Nordic power at the UN much later, she has also noted how the Nordics really form part of a group one could call the middle powers, which have sought to bolster the United Nations capacity for collective actions. And the Nordics, along with, for example, the Netherlands, are among the best known middle powers. So they're like-minded about making multilateralism matter. And so they do this despite sort of not being the largest state. They believe very much in this. And as you will know, the Nordic states have agreed on a rotation, amongst them. So it's not coincidental that Denmark is currently campaigning for a seat, that Norway is about to finish its term, and that Sweden, just a few years before that, had its term. And I think this is also something that's part of something the Nordic states have seen as a productive division of labor, that they do this on a regular basis. Last year was actually the first time a Nordic and a Baltic country served together on the UN Security Council for the first time. And this is why we wrote the report that Nils and Andreas has talked about. What was interesting to see, and at least a bit surprising for me, because we tend to think about the Nordic states and the Baltic states as quite similar, and the Baltic states are also part of this extended way of thinking about the region and also about being like-minded. But we also found that when the year that Estonia and Norway was on the Security Council together, they did approach things quite similarly, but they also had some differences that we found interesting, because it was the first time that Estonia served on the UN Security Council, while Norway had been there 4 times. This is the 5th time that Norway is on the Security Council. So we found that they had a bit different starting points. So Norway was kind of building on its own experience in the past. It sort of had a script that it could go back to and then revise and sort of think about this in a historical way. Whereas in Estonia, the researchers there pointed out that the UN has not been that important in the past. It's important now, but it doesn't have the same tradition of thinking about the UN as a cornerstone of the foreign policy, as has been much more the case in Norway and I think in Denmark too. that is sort of this saying that the UN is the cornerstone of the foreign policy. So that was a bit different. And we also found that where sort of Norway wanted to play a role in promoting multilateral cooperation and peace building, Estonia as a newcomer was quite bold in a sense. They had an innovative approach on the UN Security Council. So whereas Norway highlighted some of the issues that have been very important in Norwegian foreign policy in the past, and Nils mentioned them, like women, peace and security, like climate security, which is sort of coming. These are very important issues, obviously, but they're sometimes framed as soft issues. But Estonia, on the other hand, came on and focused quite explicitly on Ukraine and Belarus from the beginning. So it sort of set out to tackle more of those issues that we think of as hard security issues. And it also tried, in some cases successfully, to put cybersecurity on the agenda. So small states do not necessarily do the same when they are members of the UN Security Council. That was my point, really, and that is where I will end, I think. And just also with an observation to say that the Nordic states, the fact that they do rotate on seeking a member on the UN membership on the Security Council is very helpful for the Nordics, and I think it speaks to this fact that they often use each other as reference points. So even the fact that we have this seminar here today is also testimony to how that knowledge is passed on. And in Norway, it was very much the same. So when Norway was taking over, the Swedish case was studied in detail. How did Sweden evaluate its performance on this UN Security Council? How did they work, and what kind of lessons can Norway learn for its term? So I'll end there, and thank you, Andreas, for being patient with me.
All right, thank you so much. Very interesting to hear your comparison of the small states, how they operate in the Security Council, and also very useful to have you challenging the conventional wisdom of small states in the Security Council and what powers they can wield. And I found the concept of norm entrepreneurs very interesting. I'll have to look that up. So with that, let's move on to the Q&A session. And as usual, at these seminars, please state your name and your professional background before asking a question. And please be relatively brief when you ask the questions. And we'll also have a microphone being passed around, I'm sure, right? Good. So you'll also have to wait for that. But I hope you will indulge me if I start by asking the first question myself. So earlier this year, the Danish government launched its foreign security strategy, and it contains some interesting insights on various topics, including the UN Security Council membership that we are hoping to achieve in 2025. But maybe I should go back a little bit and say that the strategy was structured in a way so that value-based diplomacy took a very it was on the top of the agenda, you could say, in the strategy, and that Danish foreign policy should be guided by this moral compass or value-based compass, as it was said in the strategy. So at the same time, when it talked about the membership of the Security Council, it said something along the lines of Denmark trying to become a steward of the council or a bridge builder. And I was just wondering, can you at the same time pursue a values-based diplomacy and build bridges within the council, especially given the current environment? I mean, if you seek to build relationships with like-minded states, and actually it also said in the strategy that we want to reach out to those that share our values. It said that several times in the strategy. If that's the bottom line of how we are going about with our foreign policy strategy, and at the same time we envision our role in the council as being the shop steward or bridge builder, can you even combine those two roles as you see it, given what you have experienced from the Norwegian membership of the council? So I'm curious about your thoughts on that. And yeah, maybe I have another question, but I can wait until later with that. So maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that diplomacy is about building relations, right? But you have to have your values when you go into those relations. So, but you really need to try to get others to think about your values in the same way. But there's a lot of the Security Council. There's something there that you can't do anything with, and that's the structure. So the way you have to really deal with that structure. There's 10 elected and 5 permanent, and the permanent, they have veto power. So this means that you have to, it's a very consensus-focused council. So you need to get all the other member states to like what you're saying. You need to work on the relations, and you need to get them on board. But that doesn't mean that you have to throw all your values overboard, because like Norway is a very has like Norway and Denmark and Sweden, the Scandinavian countries, is very it's not difficult to know what they will do while they're in the council, because they have strong traditions. There's something that they are really focused on, and they bring this to the council, and it's not a surprise. And you have to do negotiations, and you have to get the other countries on board, and you have this is the diplomatic work in the council, and it has to pay attention to the veto power, and it has to get everyone on board. So yeah, so but a little bit more in detail, you can try to be smart, and you can try to instead of trying to adopt a resolution, a big resolution on climate security, for instance, you can try to bring climate security language into other resolutions and mandates, into the texts. And then you can try to get your values into Security Council texts in a way that is not that difficult for other states that are not that does not look upon the same things in the same way as you. It's easier for them to swallow that. Yeah.
Kristin, do you want to?
No, I think Nils answered that quite well, and it would have been interesting actually to see the text that you were referring to too, if it was sort of in general about value-based diplomacy towards anyone or towards specific groups, but it didn't specify, I assume, since you posed the question that way.
It was a general approach, and it takes a very strong position based on liberal human rights. So I was just wondering whether you are able to build coalitions in the Security Council if you put values first, so to speak. It actually does that very specifically in the preface, saying values come before reality, as it says. Værdier før virkelighed in Danish. So that's at least an interesting approach. I think the language might have been moderated a bit in the more recent white book from the ministry, but maybe we can see more about that.
Yeah, so in general, I'd say in organizations like the UN, including in the EU and other places, I'd say prior to decision making, unilateral consultations will often be very important. So consultations in groups and with sort of states trying to find common ground with other states. And I would say that the tendency is that there is like-mindedness or this sense of like-mindedness, at least, between the states that do seek such coalitions together. But on the other hand, I mean, at the UN, there are certainly traditions also for seeking together for sort of more pragmatic outcomes. But it is, I think, and also what you're alluding to, whose values? Are they sort of universal values? And sometimes that can probably be problematic if you are from a Nordic country and one thinks that the values that exist in our societies are universal values. These are the ones that should sort of be on top of the hierarchy, the top of the pyramid. and it might be difficult then to express that in diplomacy with states who do not think the same way about how these hierarchies should work, and how much states, for example, should have an opinion about domestic affairs in other states.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, I mean, this is a tension that is there, and obviously it will be hard to do both. But I think for states like the Nordics, I think it is in their it is in their backbone to still state it and still try to have that as a guidance for their foreign policy.
All right. Let's have some other questions. Amelia?
Thanks so much for the presentations. My name's Emily Gadimi. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission at the Irish Embassy here in Copenhagen. So obviously another relatively small state, just wrapping up our 2-year elected term as well. I was just really interested to hear what you were describing, just learning about sort of the agreed rotation with Nordic states, and maybe if you could speak a little bit about if there is coordination on carrying forward particular agenda items. What sort of strikes me, like you mentioned, say, for example, on climate and security, on WPS, you know, on disarmament, which is a very, you know, is a key priority for Ireland, that, you know, part of the challenge with elected members is not having the continuity. And actually, if there's sort of an agreed rotation with the Nordics, if there's also agreed coordination on actually making progress on these and not just sort of saying, okay, we'll pick this up and maybe learn from the approaches, but maybe not necessarily take the next step with the agenda items. So if you could speak a little bit to that. So thanks so much.
Do you collect or do you?
Yeah, I think you could answer this one already. Yeah.
I think you have to help me with the terms, Nils. Like how do you remember how the rotation? Or maybe you, Louise, remember the rotation for the Nordic states?
Did you turn on the?
Oh.
It is on. No, it was on before. Oh, it was on. I can turn it up.
So it's a very good question, and I have to think like the rotation between the Nordic states, the sort of the intervals. Would you remember that, Louise? Yeah. So we'll get some help from that.
I'm Louise Ries Andersen. I'm from the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I work on the Security Council campaign team. And so the rotation is that there's a Nordic country running for the Security Council every fourth year. So Norway was elected at the elections in 2020, and we will hopefully be elected in 2024. And so it goes like that. That means that every 20 years, we have to be on the council, or we have to try to be on the council.
Mm-hmm.
Finland didn't succeed when they tried in 2014, I think it was. And I think if I can comment also on the question of whether this rotation, it means more than just when do you run for a seat, and also what do you run on. We don't have sort of a formal arrangement on that, but it's more this idea that you mentioned, that part of the weakness of the elected members is that they don't have continuity, whereas the permanent members, they have 78 years of institutional memory of what it means to be on the council, whereas we have to reinvent it every 20 years. So this idea of taking on the baton from other elected members, I think that's very strong. For at least the Norwegians took that idea, and the Swedish did, and also others like climate security, which has been taken on by several elected members, is an example of that. Rather than trying to come with your own ideas and simply trying something new every time, then going with what's already there and pushing agendas forward. Yep.
Thank you, Louise.
It's good to get some help with the details. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, just take another one, Amelia.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, colleagues, and it's super thrilled. My name is Sean, by the way. I work at the Norwegian Embassy here in Copenhagen, and until very recently, I was on the Syria team. So until the 12th of July, actually, working on the negotiations in New York. Extremely challenging, but yeah, we managed to renew the mandate for 6 months at least with our Irish colleagues as co-pen holders, and gain some experiences based on that and many other issues in the council, of course. Just wanted to thank you very much for your very valuable insights on small states' role in the Security Council and echo everything you say. Just wanted to add a couple of small points based on what I saw during my time in Oslo covering the Security Council and Syria, because there are some very apparent added values as a small state in the Security Council. I think the first and most obvious one is that we support humanitarian actors, we support civil society, so it's a lot easier for us to reach out to organizations in the field, in the countries that are on the council agenda, and bring those insights to New York, and where appropriate, also invite voices from civil society and humanitarian actors to the Security Council. We did that a couple of times. Not always easy, especially with civil society and human rights activists, but at least it's something that we definitely can do easier and better than perhaps other states. Also researchers, by the way. On the norm entrepreneurship or sustaining, protecting norms and standards, I think we also play a better role than other states. I think that we can be less intimidating when we talk about norms, and I think that it's harder for other states, the big power states, to accuse us of having double standards when we talk about upholding norms and standards in international law. You mentioned one of our signature events on peace and diplomacy. We also had another one led by our Prime Minister on urban warfare and protection of civilians, and that was 1 month before the war in Ukraine. Maybe it didn't change the war in Ukraine and the way that the Russians are doing their warfare, but it's definitely increasing the cost, you ask me. We also did some other initiatives on protection of civilians and attacks on civilian infrastructure. And then would definitely say that we have convening power for perhaps primarily the E10 countries, which is a very mixed bag of states, always, every year. And I think it's easier for a small state to get together with the different E10 countries and make sure that we have a common position either before the P5 have a say or after, depending on the case. And I remember we did that very actively in the Syria case, where we tried to convene the E10 and managed to get everyone together in making sure that we renew the cross-border aid to Syria. So definitely an added value as a small state, and wish all the best to Denmark in their candidacy and membership. Hopefully add something.
Thank you for sharing those insights. I don't know if you want to comment on any of those.
I think I guess it shows or demonstrates the point that I was trying to make earlier as well, that small states too can actually have a greater room for maneuver in some instances than larger states, simply because they can work a bit under the radar, and it might not be as intimidating as you put it. So I think that's also probably why the norm entrepreneurship works in a different way for smaller states than it does for larger ones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for very good comments. And I just want to say that in a way, it was a very. I know that the Syria resolution, the renewal of that mandate, was very difficult, and that Norway was penholder there and did very much hard work. And it was renewed, but just for 6 months, and we were hoping for 12. But I think that this is also something that, in a way, could be taken into account of a not so paralyzed Security Council, actually, because renewing this mandate, it hasn't been every year for the last 6 years at least. It has been in the Security Council very, very much the Security Council and the international diplomacy have been very nervous about this renewal, because it hasn't been easy. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't easy this year either, and it was, of course, down from 12 months to 6 months, but you got there, and that I think that also adds to the story about the Security Council being not so paralyzed. And you have to look at all this. Is there spillover on other files than Ukraine in the Security Council? And we were very afraid of spillovers on the Syria file. Had a mandate, and before that there was a lot of nervousness about the Afghanistan file, which got a strong mandate in March. So there was no spillover in a way there either. But there is one very visible spillover, and that is that in the climate in the Security Council between the diplomats, the gloves are off. The gloves are off. Very tough talks. It's a completely different atmosphere than before the 24th of February or in January. I mean, before the invasion in 24th of February. But the last day of the Norwegian Presidency in the Security Council was the last day in January. That was the first meeting on Ukraine, I think. It was really, really tough talks. And it was something different than we had seen before. So that's a spillover on that in the Security Council, but not that much on the file. Actually, with just one more thing, if you compare, if you want to look at, if you want to use Security Council adopted Security Council resolutions as a measurement about on to what extent the Security Council is paralyzed or not, you could compare it with the last year, and this year the Security Council has adopted, I think, 31 resolutions, and same time last year it had adopted 29. So it's almost equal, but two more this year. So it's not that paralyzed.
But what if you compare it to, let's say, 8-10 years ago?
I think that so we are also in the introduction to this seminar on the webpage. It said that are we going into another Cold War? There's a lot of things that are very similar to how it was during the Cold War, but in the Security Council was almost not able to adopt any resolutions at all. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, you saw a very strong increase in the resolutions, and it has it's not back in the Cold War days in the Council.
That's true. Yeah. Okay, let's have some more questions. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
My name is Emily Meyer. I have an academic background in global politics and security risk management. So kind of reflecting upon the United States repeal of Roe versus Wade this summer, as well as the Nordics' reputation of being a norm entrepreneur, I was wondering if you could touch upon a bit of how you think that this change has influenced and will influence the Nordic states' agenda.
Do you want me to go first?
Which one? Which change? Could you just
Roe versus Wade. Yeah.
The abortion access and women's health care.
So I understand why you asked the question. And I think, so I was saying earlier as well, you know, that this issue about whether to intervene in other states' domestic affairs, and in a sense of, and I haven't followed this explicitly close, like the Norwegian reactions to Roe versus Wade in terms of foreign policy. But I think in general, one is quite careful to make statements, you know, about internal decisions in other states. But so I don't really see that affecting the UN Security Council agenda. But I see, you know, cases like that often being brought to politicians' attentions by the media, and then the media will comment. Then the government may or may not comment. But one is often quite careful to enter into issues that are seen to fall into the domestic domain. That would be my sort of general and not very detailed comment.
Yes, hello. My name is Kaspar Grossenbacher. I'm the deputy at the Swiss Embassy here in Denmark. As you're probably aware, Switzerland got also elected as a non-permanent member last June for 2023 and 24. So I'm very grateful for this discussion. Thank you very much. Maybe just one small remark regarding values, because before coming to Denmark, I worked in the Swiss Human Rights Policy Office. And I think it's important to say, if you're talking about human rights, that's not only a value discussion, because it's also a hard law discussion. I mean, if you violate the UN Convention Against Torture, you're violating hard law. So it's not a question of values, but it's also very much an international law question. My question to the speaker is very concrete. We also have adapted some priorities for our membership. And you mentioned, Niels, already the presidency and this kind of retreat for also promoting these priorities. Can you mention maybe some more possibilities how we should and could promote our priorities in the next years? Thank you very much.
Yeah, congratulations with the seat in the Security Council. I'm looking forward to follow up, pay attention to, and follow how you're doing in that period. Some more ways to influence the council. There is of course the most obvious ways are the presidency and the penholdership. I think that during the presidency, Norway also had this that the diplomat from the Norwegian embassy here mentioned. In addition to that, because that during the presidency, it's possible to have very high level presence from politicians. So Norway also had this high level meeting on Afghanistan, where the Norwegian Prime Minister, he chaired that meeting. And Afghanistan is also a file that Norway was or is penholder for. So it's good to see these different arenas in combination, I think, and to plan really with to as soon as you know when you will have the presidency. I think that it's a smart thing to try to start planning immediately, and to think about the other files and your priorities, and to try to really push forward on your priorities during the presidency. And you know, the penholdership and the leading the sanctions committees and the experts groups, it's I think that's a give and take. I don't know how much you can influence on which groups and which responsibilities you get, but you could of course try to lobby that. And I know that there was some Norway did some of that and got some of what they wanted. So that's of course important. And there's also another thing that during the Security Council membership, you really need to find something to show, some success to show domestically. And the most easy thing is to say that, okay, we got this resolution. But if you're too focused on that, that's a risk, I think, because it's difficult to get a resolution. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of hard diplomatic work, and it takes also very good timing. So if the timing isn't there, you can risk not getting a resolution at all. So for some countries, it's very important to get a resolution during their presidency. I think that Norway chose a different strategy. And they tried to raise some topics that was important for Norway to try to prepare the ground for a resolution during the presidency. And they also put during the presidency a resolution proposal in blueprint, but kept it there until the timing was right. So the presidency was in January, and the timing was right in May, I think, and they got it through, which was an achievement, major achievement. So it was very difficult to. This was a resolution on the Bay of Guinea and law of the sea and piracy, and it was very difficult to get China on board there. So they had to work and prepare the ground, and it was started during the presidency. But but Norway didn't get a resolution during the presidency. So we can't say that the presidency was really good. We got this and this resolution. But Norway worked the council worked in the back rooms and in the corridors. And I think they got this and a couple of other achievements during their membership right now.
All right. We have another question down there.
Thank you. My name is Ture Magnussen. I have an academic background, but now I'm a pensionist and activist in the Danish UN Association as well. Thank you for interesting statements on similarities of small states. But if we look more specific and make a comparison on the Danish position now, trying to obtain a place in the UN Security Council, and compare it when Norway was in the same situation, I think that there are some very big differences, geopolitical, which you didn't mention. Denmark, in its present policy, have been very hard criticized by a lot of UN committees last year of the United High Commissioner for Refugees, also backed up by Jan Egeland in Norway. Denmark hasn't ratified even hardcore UN conventions like the Convention Against Enforced Disappearances, although it has been promised for many years. Denmark is not active in the fight against nuclear weapons, while Norway participated in the Vienna Conference for a ban on nuclear weapons. The Danish government totally refused even to send a representative or an observer for that. On the other hand, Norway have had a reputation of being active in conflict resolution, very active in also fighting torture, while Denmark in its policy on refugees have sent people and refugees back to torture, which is against hard law of the UN. So I think that there are some very, very obvious differences in the position. And maybe that was not your angle, but then I will ask the question if you would compare the chances, so to say, for that Denmark will obtain a seat with such heavy criticism in the recent years, with the situation of Norway, which seemed to have also with the whole Brundtland tradition a much more internationally respected position.
Thank you. That was a hard one.
Campaigns, or?
I don't know that much about Danish foreign politics and all the cases that you mentioned there. But I think that the big picture, Norway and Denmark are very equal. And I also think that the Security Council is never better than the sum of all the member states. And I think that Denmark for sure will contribute to get that sum in a positive direction when they're there. But there's of course in international politics and in international politics and foreign politics, there's always a lot of contradicting concerns and issues and topics, and that is something that every country brings to the table in the Security Council, I think. I don't know if Norway is any better than Denmark there, but yeah. So yeah, I can't go really much more into the details, I think.
Okay.
Can I add?
Yeah, you can add something, yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
Because I think what Nils is saying is, I mean, I've researched the Nordic countries for the past couple of years, and I think, you know, when people in the Nordic region, they will be aware of the differences between the Nordic countries. We will know about the niches, and we will know about sort of the sub-identities that the Nordic states have within the Nordic region. So the differences between Sweden and Denmark, for example, will be evident to observers in the Nordic region. But I think if you sit in Beijing, or you are in Washington, or you are in the UN headquarters, I do not think the differences between the Nordic countries are that explicit, simply because they are relatively more similar than many other states in the world. So I wouldn't know the campaigns well enough to know how much one dwell into details of the foreign policies of each countries. But I think the reputation that you have on the international stage, and the fact that Denmark is a Nordic country, I think will, in most external observers' eye, make them more similar, even though differences would be more evident to observers here in the Nordic region. And actually, just also wanted to mention that because when Norway won its current seat, it was up against Canada, wasn't it? And some were saying that afterwards, one was sort of trying to evaluate why Norway had won in the end, that these countries were considered quite similar, and Ireland was in the same round as well. And to Canada, sort of to find a reason why it had not been chosen that time, but the fact is that there are very small differences involved, and there is a lot of effort that goes into the campaign, and sometimes it can be about the campaign too, just someone having found actually the sort of good way to win votes over. So I think there are sometimes just very small differences that makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Good. We have another question.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Shirin. I am an academic. I'm Danish with Iraqi roots. So my question to you is about being like-minded. I don't think this is a strength. I don't think this is anything you can use as a tool in warfare. I think it's a fact, right? So how should Denmark, along with Norway and other Scandinavian countries, prepare themselves when Finland and Sweden will become members of the UN Security Council? And what is the strategy towards Russia and Turkey? Because we're also planning to implement sustainability strategies in Turkey. We have a council there. So I think the strength will be part of preparing for the unprepared and the intercultural understanding, whether or not you like Russia. So that is my question. Yeah.
Just a clarification, you meant NATO?
No, I'm actually referring. Yes, okay. So they will become part of the NATO. But what is the general picture, the general approach
in
compared to the statement about being like-minded? Because I don't think it's a strength.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a fact. Yeah.
So first of all, so I think in the setting of NATO, and I can only, of course, as a researcher, refer to what the governments are saying. I think it's a relatively widespread agreement among the Nordic governments that they do see it as positive that the Finnish and Swedish governments have decided to apply for membership and seems to be joining, but we don't know yet, basically, how the result, what the result will be before it's nothing is clear before everything is clear. But I think for Nordic cooperation and Nordic defense cooperation, which I have been studying a bit for the last couple of years, I think this is something that is seen as something that removes barriers, because the 5 countries have seen themselves as being like-minded, but there has been a very distinct barrier to how far one could proceed with Nordic security and defense cooperation, simply because Denmark, Norway and Iceland has been in NATO and the others have not. So that has sort of put the limits on how much they can cooperate. But your question was related to how this impacts UN Security Council dynamics.
Yes, I think I mixed NATO with security.
Right. Of course, but I think in the case of the Nordic countries, I would make the claim that it makes them more like-minded. So the fact that they come into NATO, because this has been a very major dividing line between the 5 Nordic countries. It's always been sort of the security outlook that has made them different historically. Their relations with Russia, and also how close they have tied themselves to the US as sort of the leading state in NATO. So I would, you know, I haven't yet come then to the part 2 of your question, which is how the like-mindedness affect their role in the world. Is that your question, or?
So we all know when Sweden and Finland become members, it will have consequences. What is our approach on that?
Yes, and I think their approach is, I think the government's approach is that NATO is a defense alliance, and they see this as, you know, something that, well, they cannot control how it is perceived in Moscow specifically, but I do not think they see this as something that is in itself going to trigger a major reaction. But of course, we do not know. But I think the answer to your first part of your question is that I think they see this as making them more like-minded.
All right, we have a couple of minutes left for one last question.
Thank you so much. My name is Trine. I'm a research assistant here at DIIS. Prior to that, I was with the Secretariat for around a year, trying to decode the complexity of the dialogue in the General Assembly and in the First Committee too. Particularly the very complex layers of discussions in the UN security too. So this almost devilish complex discourse that there can be among diplomats. Would you say that there could be maybe a very simple, light-hearted, but interesting task for smaller states in decoding the discussions, debates, and also conclusions that come out of the UN Security Council, just in the name of democratic accountability, but also public information?
A complex question, and you only have a couple of minutes.
Like that? So, you know, the way you present it, yes, I think that sounds very interesting. And I think, you know, part of what one does at seminars like this, but also the current discussions that are going on in terms of evaluating how different states work as diplomatic efforts really in international organization. I think, you know, gathering all those insights and making them objects of study, I think as researchers, that's obviously what we are interested in. So I think that kind of empirics, at least for me, that's super interesting to look at, like patterns in how diplomatic engagements happen in these fora. So
Definitely.
All right, we are running out of time. I think it was a very lively and useful Q&A session. We got a lot of additional insights, not just from the panelists, but also from you in the audience. So thank you very much for participating today. And remember that this was just the first seminar of a seminar series on the UN Security Council and the UN as an organization. So keep looking for additional events from these. And with that, just let's conclude with an applause for our panelists.